There actually now is a pathway to power for reform to actually win the general election and for Nigel to become Prime Minister. Diversity is our greatest weakness. By 2050, in 25 years, the Muslim population in this country could rise to the politics of Pakistan were imported into Britain. Arson attacks, we had MPs cowering in Parliament, too scared to leave, MPs installing panic buttons in their offices, so concerned were they by the demographic that they had actually invited into the country.
An individual who is fleeing war, coming to a country that is hostile to them, must be absolutely horrific as well.
This is an issue of cultural compatibility. So I've argued for a long time that we need to...
I've not heard that before.
It's my idea.
61% of regular Heretics viewers haven't subscribed yet. Can I ask you a favour? If you love these fearless conversations, hit subscribe now because it's free, takes 2 seconds and powers our mission.
Rafe Heydel-Mankoo, welcome to the show.
Great pleasure. Long admired the show. Delightful to be with you today.
Oh, thank you. And today, of all days, when we're recording, there's been a big boost for reform. They're just winning stuff. So are we all racist? Has the country turned into big right-wing racists?
Well, I think, Reform's policy platform, which has always been derided as racist, is actually a pretty standard, middle-of-the-road conservative policy of the 1980s. That's how far the Overton window has shifted in British politics, that policies you would have expected Margaret Thatcher or anybody in the 80s to come out with are now deemed to be beyond the pale. Some of us might like reform to go a bit further, actually, than they have done, but it's hugely encouraging to see this result. I think we are in one of, potentially at the moment now, where the tectonic plates of politics could shift as they do once in a century. So it was 100 years ago that we saw the Liberal Party cease to be the second party after the Conservative Party, and the Labour Party took over from them. And since then, we've had these two dinosaurs battling it out. But we may be at a point now where we have a new party of the right in reform to take the place of the Tory party. Certainly, I think after these local elections, it's almost guaranteed now that Kemi Badenoch will not lead the Tories into the next election. I think that if they are to have any hope of taming the reform dragon or catching its tail, they will need a figure like Jenrick to, in essence, outflank Farage on many of these policy issues. But this is a crucial moment. But of course, if it is to succeed as a party, the reform cannot have any sort of pact with the Tory party. It can't have any sort of alliance with the Tory party. It has to look at the long game here. It has to look in decades rather than in years. And that means that there has to be essentially an attempt at a hostile takeover of the Tory party. Only by doing that will you have a chance to have the integrity of the party remain. Because quite frankly, the Tory party, in my view, needs to die. It has betrayed the British people in election after election. They blatantly lied about lowering mass immigration, which in my view is the greatest act of harm in our Long Island story. Immigration was far worse under Boris Johnson than it was even under Tony Blair. And we had the great Brexit betrayal. And I don't think that, the definition of insanity is to do the same thing over and over again, Einstein said. And I think nobody can trust the Conservatives. As much as I like Robert Jenrick, even if he became leader, he's still governing a party that isn't terribly wet. I mean, the average... the average Tory MP is to the left of the British public, the average British voter on immigration still to this day. So reform does have to take serious account of its future right now. I think this is a pivotal moment. It's very encouraging to see. I know there are lots of people on the right who are upset with some of Nigel's perceived watering down of the message, but clearly what they're doing is working. And let's just hope that when they get into power, they will have the conviction of their principles to actually do what needs to be done. But I think, more power to them because they are the only hope in town.
It's interesting what you say about not, doing the same thing several times is madness. Is it not like, I'm thinking of it as like a football team that got rid of their manager because they kept losing. They got a new manager now. Kemi, what is it about Kemi that's not quite right that you prefer Robert Jenrick? Because Kemi, I think she's come out quite hard now on the trans issue, which needed to be done. She's also now saying, hey, this whole immigration thing's a bit nuts. What's not great for you with Kemi Badenoch?
She's not up to the job. She routinely fails and consistently fails to impress during PMQs. She had a very good one recently, but they're so few and far between that people take note when you do get a good performance. And I think on immigration, she was somebody who lobbied to remove the cap on student visas, for example. I don't think her track record is very good, which makes one wonder about how committed she truly is to many of these causes. And I think essentially there was a great debate and dilemma within the Tory party when it came to the election of the new leader as to who would be the best candidate. Many people were pivoting towards, say, Tom Tugendhat, saying, well, we mustn't lose people to the Lib Dems. But of course, we've seen from all the polling that the vast bulk of the people who've gone over to any party haven't gone to the Lib Dems, they've gone to the Reform Party. I'm talking about people who didn't vote in the last election in 2019, people who stayed at home, who would have voted Tory, they haven't gone to the Lib Dems. The vast majority have gone to the Tory party. And it's only by essentially outflanking Nigel Farage that you are going to get any hope of having a proper challenge to the Reform Party. As I say, this is Reform's game to lose. Now, it always used to be the case, and I always used to make this argument, that we can't afford to have two parties on the right. Because although people think that Britain is a conservative country, in effect, only 40% of the nation vote for centre-right parties. 60% of the country consistently vote for centre-left parties. The reason that the Tories have been the natural party of government for so long is because the left's vote has been split between Labour, Lib Dem, Green, SNP, Plaid.
Yeah.
And we've always thought, well, if you split that Tory vote, you'll never get a Conservative government or a small c Conservative government back in power. Reform has shown that you can do that because of the great realignment we saw with the Red Wall, where because of the policies of woke that were pursued by the Labour government, mass immigration and all of the crazy ideology that came out of it, suddenly we saw those old-fashioned Labour voters, the small c Conservative patriots who were being shunned by the Labour Party, who hated the flag. Remember Emily Thornberry tweeting the white van man who had the English flag on his thing with derision. And they lent their vote to Boris Johnson. So the Tories could have capitalised on that vote. They had that opportunity in 2019 to cement, because they were lent that vote by the public, and they needed to basically prove themselves over the course of those 5 years by levelling up and by delivering on Brexit. And of course, what did we see? We saw the Boris wave of immigration, and it wasn't European immigration as it had been before Brexit. It was immigration from the developing world, with people importing abhorrent cultural practices and just a general rise in a sense of feeling that you no longer recognize the town in which you had lived. And of course, because of COVID and the furlough scheme, there was no money for levelling up either. And so that vote was betrayed, and that vote has gone to Reform. And Reform is more closely allied to the values of those sorts of voters. So actually now, because Reform is doing what we didn't think possible, it's taken votes from the Tories and it's taken vote from Labour.
Yeah.
There actually now is a pathway to power for Reform to actually win the general election and for Nigel to become Prime Minister. I mean, it's not necessarily, it's still a tricky path to secure, but there is a clear path there, because remember, you only need to have 32% of the vote to win a majority election in this country. Keir Starmer is in power with 33% of the vote. That's given him a 450-seat majority. Since the Second World War, no party has ever had a majority of the electorate voting for them. So there is a clear path to power here for Farage if he plays his game wisely. And I think that's why you're seeing him be so careful about many of these policy issues.
Do you notice? I've started to notice a change in the air. Even this YouTube channel I started a year and a half ago, and I had to very quietly even speak about it in public. I didn't want people to know. It was embarrassing. I'm a far right lunatic. And now it's like the young people, students, just very milk toast normal people are going, I think it has to be Reform. Are you noticing that happen? And is that going to happen even more over the next few years as people realise the full scale of immigration?
Yeah, and people, of course, are realising how sensible Reform's policies are, because they're not mad policies or swivel-eyed loons as people even in the Tory party would like you to believe. They are common sense policies, as I said, that were mainstream belief not that long ago. They aren't radical. You compare the Reform Party to the current government of Sweden. My God, Reform is to the left of the current government of Sweden. These are elected. I mean, they got a whole range of policies on immigration and others, which the British public would balk at if they saw them.
Well, so I want to say with that, do you know much about that? All I know of Sweden is it's just, I'm seeing videos every day that it's just become Islamified, basically.
Well, it's because of that. So Sweden has elected, the Swedish Democrats have been very strong on anti-immigration. And so Sweden, going through a terrible period, of course, where they had a huge demographic change, is this the centre of Europe for rape and for bombings, remarkably, through gangs and so forth, particularly from North African gangs. And with this election, they promised to bring it down, and they've become the first country in Europe now to have negative immigration. So not net zero, it's net minus zero. They've got more people leaving the country than coming in. Firstly, because immigrants who are there are scared of the draconian policies that may come into place, so they're voluntarily leaving. People are they're having forced deportations. People are giving notices to go, and they're also doing voluntary remigration. So they're paying people 30,000 kroner, I think it's around 30,000 euros, to leave the country because they've done the mathematics. I mean, we know it here. I mean, the vast majority of immigrants who come to this country are low-skilled immigrants. And they are a net drain on the British economy from the moment they set foot upon British soil. By the time a low-skilled immigrant gets to the age of pension, they cost £151,000 each to the British taxpayer. If they get to 80, they cost £465,000 each to the British taxpayer. So a one-off payment of, say, 30,000 saves you in the long run. And so they've embraced that policy as well, and it's clearly working. And then they've got their asylum applications down to levels of they didn't see since the 1990s.
Wow!
So I think it's very interesting and exciting to see what they're doing, and the Danes are also at it. So and then there's a left-wing party in Denmark that's been doing that. So reform is very much middle of the road. You've got President Trump talking about mass deportation as well, and I think a lot of what's happening in America, if that's been seen to be a success, the success of his policies on woke, the success of his policies on immigration, I think you will see a tsunami crossing the Atlantic, crashing on the shores here, which will make even more people think, actually, he's onto something here. This is something that we need to embrace and understand.
It's funny that immigration is seen as a right-wing issue or anti-immigration, but obviously there are countries in the world where the left is more the nationalistic side. I often talk about Argentina as being where I used to live. The left are the ones with the flags and the national anthem and all of that stuff. This might become, across the parties, this might become something that, it seems that Labour also want to go a bit harder on this. Do you think this, in the next few years, maybe this won't even be like, it's right or left or Reform or Labour or Conservatives, just everyone is just going to shut down the borders?
No, because the Tory party have had 14 years to do it and consistently failed to do it. You have to remember, of course, we need to go back a bit and understand what happened here. Why do we have mass immigration? It was a deliberate political and ideological project of the Labour Party of Tony Blair and New Labour. There was a clear policy designed to open the borders. Peter Mandelson admitted that they actually sent out search parties to look for immigrants to bring over to this country. And we had a glimpse behind the curtain, a glimpse behind the door of number 10 when Andrew Neither, who was the speechwriter to the immigration minister under Tony Blair, after he left office, he wrote an article in the Evening Standard, which was remarkably frank and shocked many people in the Labour Party for being so honest. And he said, we wanted to rub the right's nose in diversity. And they wanted essentially to introduce a new demographic into the country. Why? Because 80% of ethnic minorities vote for the Labour Party. Oh my God. And by having mass immigration, you would ensure that in the decades to come, you would have guaranteed majorities for the Labour Party in power, on both the local and the national level. And if you look at cities like London and elsewhere in the north of England, of course, it's a policy that clearly has succeeded. London is a one-party Labour state as a result of that. So that was a clear design there. Of course, it's backfired on them hugely, as most policies that are done on the back of an envelope backfire terribly. They didn't foresee, of course, all the terrors and horrors that would come through that, not least, of course, the fact that, particularly with the Muslim vote, Muslims eventually are deciding, well, actually, we don't need you people any longer. We've got where we want to be. We're going to have our own party. We're going to elect our own Muslim MPs. And so you've had 5 Muslim MPs, which include Jeremy Corbyn in that, elected not to improve hospitals, not to improve local education and schools and so forth, but on an issue about Gaza and Palestine, not reflecting the views of those members who aren't Muslim or those Muslim members who actually are concerned about local issues and the plight of Britain. And of course, we saw at the last election, the politics of Pakistan were imported into Britain, right? We had, you may remember, we had, arson attacks. We had an MP's office, constituent office burned to the ground. We had mobs in the streets intimidating MPs outside their homes. We had MPs cowering in Parliament, too scared to leave for fear of meeting the mobs outside. And we had MPs installing panic buttons in their offices, so concerned were they by the demographic that they had actually invited into the country. So it's come back to bite them. As it says in Hosea, he who sows the wind shall reap the whirlwind. But of course, then you had the Tories, it made it all even worse. And under the Tories, they, of course, didn't have any political ideology behind mass immigration. For them, they were beholden to big business, to the CBI and so forth. Big business didn't want to invest heavily in capital infrastructure, which is very expensive to do, job automation, machines that can pick apples in orchards and so forth. So rather than invest in that costly technology, they would prefer to flood the nation with cheap labor. that undercuts wages as well, and it prevents that investment. And that's why, of course, we've got a system now where we're so dependent for fruit picking and everything, and so many other things in our society, when of course we could have had technology do those sorts of things. In a way, that's why Japan may actually come out of this whole thing as being the shining example of the correct thing to do, because Japan's got the most aging population in the world. Everyone thinks it's in for a troubled future, but it may be that AI, robotics, and automation come in at just the right time. Because the main issue, of course, here and in the aging countries of the world is who's going to look after the elderly and the sick. Well, actually, AI and robotics may be able to do that job and alleviate the need for all of that.
Because I keep hearing that the population decline is going to be a huge problem, but that's really, really interesting. We all have those little habits, tapping a pen, chewing gum, fiddling with stuff while we think. Mine, I found something way more satisfying. This is Fume. The sponsor of today's video, and it's honestly one of the most interesting things I've tried. It's a flavoured air device, not a vape, not a gimmick, just a really smart tool for people who like to keep their hands and mouth busy without inhaling anything nasty. No vapor, no nicotine, just natural flavours. Weighted premium design you actually want to fidget with. Clicks, magnets and airflow that sound great even on mic. My favourite flavour, mint. It's clean, sharp and leaves you with surprisingly fresh breath. If you're curious, over 500,000 people already use Fume as part of their daily routine. Grab the journey pack at tryfume.com/heretics. Use code heretics and they'll throw in a free topper to level up the experience. Scan the QR code on screen and check it out. Gosh, I suppose people find it really hard to keep two competing ideas in their head at the same time. And for me, it would be absolutely everything you've said about immigration. On the other hand, the idea of an individual who is fleeing war, seeking asylum, unable to do so, or coming to a country that is hostile to them, throwing things at their bus when they arrive, those kinds of things must be absolutely horrific as well. How do we square these two things? And I think as well of like, a lot of countries weren't good at letting Jews in during the Holocaust. Some were, some weren't. I think the Danish were particularly good. Will we look back on this later and go, people trying to flee Iran or wherever, No,
fundamentally, this is an issue of cultural compatibility. So I've argued for a long time that we need to tear up and replace the 1951 UN Convention on Refugees. That convention was created for a post-war world, and it was essentially focused exclusively on what do you do with the Jews, how do you settle them within Europe and within North America, and the Slavs. My mother's Polish. We came to London in 1940 with the Polish government. We were aristocrats who couldn't go back, would be arrested. We'd lost all our property anyway. We were homeless and penniless.
Aristocrats in Poland.
So we had to stay here. We'd be arrested or murdered and had nothing to go back for. And so that was what the 1951 Convention was designed for, was designed to settle peoples of Europe within Europe. And so my argument is you need to have a new convention of refugees for the UN, which says that people fleeing war-torn countries must be resettled within their continent of origin. So if you're fleeing Sudan, or you go to Kenya or South Africa, or you go to elsewhere in Africa. If you're fleeing Palestine, you go elsewhere in the Middle East. You're fleeing Vietnam, you go elsewhere in Asia. You're fleeing Ukraine, you come to Europe. Because it's culture that is the key thing that causes tension and division. And the closer people are to their own culture, the happier they're going to be, because they fit in more and they understand things more. But also the goal and intention of the refugee system isn't to give permanent residence to people, it's to eventually allow them to return home when the opportunity is right. And you're far more likely to return home if you're actually geographically proximate to where your homeland is. And in the case of the Middle East, for example, look, if you're a wealthy country like Saudi Arabia or the UAE and you don't want to invite immigrants in, you've got more than enough money that you can pay poorer countries in the Middle East to house them, right? Much like we're doing we were going to do with the Rwanda scheme, which actually the EU is now considering the Rwanda scheme. So there's no excuse in my mind for not having this system. And I think everybody would be far happier through a system like that.
I've not heard that before.
Well, it's mine. It's my idea.
Can you get on the phone to Farage? It was interesting what you said about the Overton window before. I was thinking there was a fellow who said the opposite. His name's something like Stadlen, Matthew Stadlen.
Oh, yes.
Is that his name? Something like that. Someone correct me in the comments. He was saying,
one of my adversaries.
So is his name, is it? That is his name. And he was talking about Douglas Murray. and he said, you see how far the Overton's window has moved because Douglas is able to say these things and he's an extremist. And what I was thinking was, but that seems bizarre to me because I know that, and I speak about this a fair bit, but 13 years ago, Stacey Dooley made a documentary for the BBC. Look at what's happened to Luton. That's what it was. Islam has taken over. She was going up aggressively to people wearing burqas, going, "What are you doing in my town? What is going on here?" She's now like dancing on ice and all that. She'd never go near that, I imagine. She seems like a very nice person. I'm not criticising her at all. But the BBC would not run that. And we must be 1,000 times more overrun in that aspect by this ideology. And yet now we won't touch it. So it seems to me that the Overton window has, as you are pointing out, gone, well, what is happening?
Well, firstly, you can ignore Matthew Stadlen. Even a broken clock is correct more times than he is on everything that I've heard him speak about. But yes, I mean, the key thing is, for the last 20 years, people haven't been forbidden from speaking about certain topics. And now finally, also through opportunities like this, the messages are getting out about the reality of what's happening. Because up until now, the news that people were being exposed to had been curated by editors at the BBC, at Channel 4 and elsewhere, and people weren't actually aware of the reality of what's going on in the world. And so to a degree, you're right, there are things that happened in the past which you couldn't do today, but I would say actually we are freer now to talk about things because we aren't going to be cancelled by mainstream channels because we have other venues in which we can make these arguments. And I would say, actually, you've just had Channel 4 putting out a documentary on the rape gangs. It's also exposing, all the other abhorrent practices that have been festering in these segregated communities over the last years. Child marriage, cousin marriage, we're now finally able to discuss. The fact that people are willing to discuss cousin marriage, as we've seen, that's
it was defended, wasn't it? There was an MP who defended it in Parliament.
Britain is now the global centre of acid attacks. There's now actually the Metropolitan Police. This is unbelievable. The Metropolitan Police are training officers in witchcraft in order to be able to detect child abuse linked to witchcraft practices from immigrants who've come here from Central Africa and so forth. So, and we've had beheadings on the street. When I was a child learning history at school, I loved the Tudors because it was all about beheadings and all these weird things. And I never thought in the 21st century that will be reintroduced into Britain. But that's the world we are. And we have to be brave enough to speak about it because the mainstream media don't talk about it. And people need to understand the reality of what's going on in this country.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree. Will Farage be our next Prime Minister? When is it? 3-4 years?
2029.
What's it now?
2025.
4 years.
So, well, who knows? I mean, a week is a long time. 4 years is an eternity. Will he still be leading reform? I imagine so. I think, but, well, I've explained to you, I think that he's every possibility of getting there. Remember, he's now leading the Tory party and the Labour Party in the polls. I think he's at 28 or something. I can't remember what the last thing is. You only need to get to 32 and he's still got 4 years. So I think, and of course, we don't know how bad immigration and the economy and everything else is going to get and how poorly Labour is going to be performing. If their current track record is anything to go by, I think, Farage might be in for a great jackpot.
It's quite exciting, really, just this big change. You've written about the sociological evidence, actual evidence that diversity is our strength is a lie. What do you mean by that?
So, well, this expression diversity is our greatest strength is sort of like a sacred mantra of the religion of woke. And you hear it sort of uttered like a rosary bead prayer by mayors and politicians and police commissioners every week almost. And yet they've never provided any evidence to actually show that. Well, in what way actually is diversity? Can you please give us a chart and explain just point by point what it is? And the reality is they don't do it because they can't do it. There is absolutely no evidence that diversity is a strength. On the contrary, we do have academic evidence, we have economic evidence, and we have sociological evidence. And sociologists are the most left-wing element of any university. Yes. And even they've had to admit that all of the evidence shows that increased ethnic diversity leads to a lowering of trust in communities. It destabilizes local neighborhoods. It makes people more reclusive. It leads to a deterioration of the public square. And it creates more unhealthy and more unhappy people. In addition to which, of course, you also get the importation of the sorts of cultural clashes and cultural issues that we see, rise in antisocial behavior and so forth, and just simply a clash between the native population and the new arrivals. Things, just simple things such as queuing up for a bus stop, littering on the streets, things which are perfectly normal in one culture but aren't normal in another culture. And so there's been no evidence provided this. They did. There was a very good book written by a left-wing American called Robert Putnam, who wrote Bowling Alone in 2007, and he did the biggest examination of this, and he showed that the areas with the highest diversity had lower voter turnout. People were more reclusive. They stayed at home. They didn't go out into the streets. Everyone watched television. They went volunteering, getting involved in community organizations. The buildings began to deteriorate. Nobody was looking after them. And they were less engaged with the world around them in general. And then you had the Danes in 2019 did a meta-analysis of all 87 studies on the issue of diversity. And they saw that they wanted to see how has immigration benefited us in diversity. And all 87 studies, these left-wing university academics looked at, they said, no, actually, there's no evidence for diversity being a strength. And I would argue that actually now, thanks to mass immigration and multiculturalism, diversity is our greatest weakness, because it's creating the rise of sectarianism in this country. We are now essentially importing the politics of Northern Ireland into this country, and it's dividing this nation into ethno-nationalist silos where people's daily lives are essentially carrying on without any interaction with anybody of a different faith or religion or ethnicity, and the more mass immigration there is, the bigger these segregated communities become. And there's no incentive for them to integrate. They have their own shops and their own churches and mosques. They watch satellite television from their home country. So they're never actually engaging with wider society. And we know that the segregated communities of Muslims, for example, in Bolton and Bradford and Burnley, there are school children there who think Britain is 90% Asian because that's all that they see every day. And we also know that segregated communities, in addition to all these cultural practices and forced marriage and everything else, we know that they also are twice as likely to become extremists as Muslims who live outside of segregated communities. And that actually is, I think, one of the biggest challenges we're going to be facing now, because the rise of radical Islam. Because the government's key role, primary role, is the safety of the nation and of its citizens. And it's now increasing defence expenditure to 2.5%, which quite rightly, from 2%. I think it should be 3%, but that's fine. But it's doing that for the external threat. But we now have, in the form of radical Islam, a fifth column in this country, which is actively working to undermine and overthrow our institutions and our structures and our very way of life. There are 40,000 people on the terror watch list that MI5 keeps, and over 90% of them are jihadis. Now, 40,000 is larger than the entire size of Hamas in October when they launched their attack.
Shit.
40,000 is larger than the entire size of the ISIS army that was in Iraq in 2014 when they launched their infamous insurgent invasion there. It's half the size of the British army, right? And that's the number of jihadis that we have in this country. And it's only going to get more serious. I think this is just as big a threat to the country, due to the growth of the Muslim population, which is currently 4 million, 6.5% of the population.
Was that the last census? So it's been 4 years since then.
So let's say 4 million. That means 1 in every 100 people is on 1 in every 100 Muslims is on the terror watch list already. It's the fastest growing population because of mass immigration and because of the high birth rates in the Islamic community. So the Pew Research Institute, which is a very respected non-partisan organization, says that by 2050, in 25 years, the Muslim population in this country could rise to just below 20%. So it would be about over 1 million, 1.2 million or so. That means if 1 in 100 are, you're going to have 120,000 people potentially on the terror watch list, which would be about a third larger than the entire size of the British army.
And what you say, 1.2 million?
The 1.2 million.
You said 20% of the population will be Muslim. There's already 4 million.
Oh, yeah, sorry. It'd be 12 million. Sorry.
12 million.
So it'd be 120. That's right. Sorry. Yeah, but yes. My decimal, I'm a historian, not a mathematician. So yes, there'll be 12 million. So you'll have 120,000 people on the terror watch list. But it gets even worse than that, of course, because that's just the people that we know about on the terror watch list. Now, we've had other polling from Populous and other organizations that's shown previously that 9% of Muslims have admitted to being extremists, fundamentalists, and supporters of terrorism. Now, 9% today is around 350 or 400,000 people, right? Mm-hmm. That's going to be about well over 1 million people in the future. So
that's greater than the army. Our army.
Well, 150,000 people on the watch list is going to be greater than our army. So it's 1/3 greater than the size of our British army. These are real challenges we're going to take. This is at the same time that we have the non-Muslim population of this country showing the lowest levels of patriotism we've ever seen. In 2004, 80% of youth 18 to 24 were patriotic. Today it's been halved to 40%. So in terms of actually having an army to actually combat this is another question, because how many people are going to want to sign up to the army and fight for king and country in the future? And it is something that I think not enough people are taking account of. We had at the New Cultural, I don't know whether you had him, Professor David Betts.
Not yet, he's coming on.
He's coming on. So he's a professor of war in the Department of War Studies at King's College. And you'll have a great chat with him. He thinks, and he's an expert on this, he thinks Britain is heading for civil war. He thinks that the Muslim world, there are going to be two major players. You have the radical Islam, which is very well advanced already, having 50,000 or 40,000 on the terror watch list. It's already very well organized. And the white identity movement, which is still in its infancy. It's not very big, not very organized, but there is the potential for that to grow, to become a rival. And he says, he talks about it in the terms of the classic insurgency, which is a Maoist insurgency of 3 stages. The first stage is what he calls the defensive stage. And that's what we've had for the last 20 years with radical Islam, where they're basically trying to work out their grievances and their victim status. They're trying to recruit people with propaganda and preaching, all the videos we see and all the marches on the street and all of that, trying to raise money. And a lot of organizations with criminal gangs too, it has to be said. And now they've done all of that, and they've got also councillors and people in politics and all of that. Now they're on the next stage, which is called the stalemate. And that's essentially when they are able to launch attacks. So we see terrorist attacks quite regularly in Britain and across Europe. They are able to have no-go zones. There are lots of areas in the north of England now where essentially police have to ask local community leaders and arrange for when they can visit. If you're a white male, you don't want to walk through any of these areas. This is what Ed Hussein did in his great book on the mosques, looking into the mosques. And they have militias already. You've seen that with like the Muslim Defense League and so forth. They have muscle when they need it. They can call upon who will dress up in black and be their enforcers of anything else. The white community is not quite, they're still in stage 1 in the very early stages, but the Muslims are full. The third stage of full civil war, I don't necessarily think we're anywhere close to. I'm not even convinced we're going to have that, but that's when the state meets the insurgents face on face and they are of equal status. But when you're talking about the numbers that we're talking about, it is time to think about it. Because remember, all great revolutions have always been a minority which knows what they're doing, taking power from a majority. And so we must never be complacent about this. But it does pose huge questions about whether we're going to remain a united kingdom or become a united nations.
We've become complacent, haven't we? It seems like we've almost willfully forgotten how precarious the kinds of rights that we've had in this country the last 100 or so years are, and how rare they are in the world, that kind of free speech and all of those things, and that there are people out there who don't agree with us and might want to colonize. It's a good point Douglas Murray made about, he said anti-Semitism is a projection, basically. It's a blank slate onto, you put your own concerns or your own projection onto. And he said one of the things that Islam, like for example, Hitler would say the Jews wanted world domination, which is what he wanted. And it was really interesting to see what he said that Muslims say about Jews, that they are the colonizers, they're colonizing, which is remarkable to say about there's one country that is the size of Wales and mostly desert. I know it's a much sought after piece of real estate, but even so, it's 50 odd, more than 50 countries are now Muslim, more and more, and now coming into Europe. And that's why they call the Jews colonizers.
Well, this is what I find so amusing and tragically amusing about the left, who are always the great anti-imperialists,
Yes.
Forever condemning Western imperialism and colonialism, and yet, of course, Islam is the great imperial colonizing religion. It's in its blood, and it was only in the 1970s that you got this nonsense that Islam means peace. There was there was never any association between Islam and peace. This was done in the 1970s to try to make Islam more palatable to naive Western liberals who fell for it and welcomed the idea in. But of course, if you want a clue about what Islam is, just look at the etymology of the name Islam. What does it mean? Submission, right? This is about submission. The only way peace is associated with Islam is when the entire world submits to Islam. Then the world will be at peace because everybody will have converted over. But apart from that, it's utterly an imperial invention, started, from a very small location, and it's spread globally. And of course, the goal of many is the caliphate, to restore the ancient system of government that ruled the Islamic world. And of course, remember, that went into Spain and to Portugal. They see Europe very much as their entitlement. They're trying to do it here. My to name drop again, but my ancestor led the right flank of the cavalry at the siege of Vienna in 1683, which stopped the Turks from attacking Europe and invading Europe. And that was the last time that Islam threatened Europe, was in 1683. And we've had 300 years of complacency since then because, of course, nobody took the Islamic world seriously because it wasn't an economic challenger to Europe. But we forgot about the centuries of war that existed between this great clash of cultures, this clash of civilizations, and we became too complacent, we became too sure of our own security and safety. That applies to all of Europe, but that also explains, of course, why Central and Eastern Europe is so opposed to mass immigration, why places like Poland haven't taken in refugees from this part of the world, because they and the Hungarians and the Romanians, they know full well what it's like to face Islam. We in Britain, of course, the problem with Britain is that it's a disadvantage to have the world's longest continuous unbroken constitution, because we've never had to fight for our freedoms. We've never actually had any of this challenge, and we were always also top dog. We were the one conquering the world, so we never had to actually think about how hard won our freedoms were. That's one of the reasons you're seeing the Irish responding so strongly to immigration, because, of course, it's happened very quickly and very fast to a small country of 5 million people, but also they had a long, hard struggle to attain their independence, and so their sense of national identity is very important to them, and having secured it relatively recently, just 100 years ago, they don't want to see it diluted or diminished very quickly. We don't have that, so we're very much the frog in the boiling water who's not quite aware of what we're at risk of losing. And that's not a risk that it's not just a risk, of course, from radical Islam, it's also a risk from our own woke youth, who now, of course, are saying that free speech is less important than not causing offense to other people, who are essentially willing to sacrifice our hard-won freedoms in the sake of multiculturalism and political correctness and everything else. So we have a multi-pronged attack on those things that were very hard struggles to get.
I wonder, because Ireland also has that very fierce woke side as well, which almost seems to have stepped in to replace the sort of lowering levels of Catholicism.
Absolutely.
It's just a mess there. And is this just another sort of reproduction of what happened in Iran, was it, and Lebanon, sort of the left helping Islam to get a foothold?
Yes, Turkey's voting for Christmas, right? Yeah, absolutely. We saw that with the revolution overthrew the Shah, where the students allied with the Ayatollah, and it wasn't long before they were for the piano wire. And let that be a lesson to everybody over here. All of those people marching in Birkenstocks and socialist worker banners and bandanas. Be careful who you ally with, because they don't respect you at all. You just have to look at the attitudes, and it's not just even such a fringe view. 52% of Muslims believe that homosexuality should be illegal. It's only 5% in the broader population. Now, I think people will be aghast on the left to hear views like that. We know, of course, what happens to gays in Palestine, for example, being thrown off buildings. But, 62% want to restrict free speech. There is a whole bunch of areas which, of course, would terribly affect the left if they ever did come to power in that way. But, of course, the naivety when it comes to these things, you have to wonder, are you being disingenuous? Are you dim? Or are you simply complicit and too beholden to the cult and ideology of woke that you can't actually say the emperor has no clothes.
I'd love to ask them. It's so hard to get lefties on. I know you get to sometimes have a bit of a bash with them on sort of that kind of TV show, but they don't want to come and have a sit-down interview for an hour. Trigonometry does well to get those guys on. They're sort of a bigger name by this point. So that's what I'm hoping as this show grows, I can get more of them on. So I just want to sit there and say, but what is it about, okay, so more and more people are coming from this place with a very different idea from us. Is it that they just think that the numbers are wrong? They might think like, well, yes, look, obviously there's an issue with the extremist sides, but it's not that many who don't like gays, and there aren't that many coming in, so we shouldn't worry. Do you think that, I wonder if that's what it is? They think, oh, it's not as much of a concern as you guys think it is.
The great problem is they assume that everybody in the world is ultimately the same. I'm a citizen of the world. We're all the same, whatever our colour and caste and creed. And it's not. The exceptionalism of the West, we are exceptional because we actually view the world differently. Even our minds are different. The Occidental mind is different to the non-Occidental mind. There are huge differences in how we perceive the world than how other cultures do. And you can't just assume that bring people to this country and overnight, they will adopt our ways and our cultures. And a classic example is I have a cousin who is a rabid lefty. I love her to death, but a complete hippie in every way. And always had fierce fights with her. Now, we at the New Culture Forum did a documentary. I think you've had Alex Phillips on your show. We did a documentary on immigration and the rise in rape. I think it's the best thing we've ever done. We showed, how rape has quadrupled in 10 years here, 400% increase in rape here. We showed that, people from Eritrea and Algeria are 20 times more likely to commit rape here than an English person would be likely to commit rape. In Germany as well, by multiples, huge factors, people from North Africa, from Middle East, from Pakistan, from Afghanistan, from Bangladesh. These are the areas where we know they have the highest incidence of rape in the world, and also when they're coming here, they don't change their culture. It was only when she saw the statistics in this video, she said to me, I feel like a fool. I always thought everybody was the same, we could all get along, now that I've seen it. But she only watched that because I'm her cousin and I made her watch it. Well, I invited her to watch it, but the left would never choose. Firstly, because of the algorithms on YouTube and so forth, you're in your echo chamber. I never see any left-wing content on YouTube because they know that I'm not left-wing. Yeah. Nobody on the left is seeing any right-wing content. So they're completely shielded from the reality of what your viewers know is true. They're not getting it from the BBC and the mainstream legacy media. They're not getting it from the newspapers. So they're living in cloud cuckoo land, in a bubble where everything is rarefied and smells of roses.
It's maybe a regretful human facet or a facet of evolution that, because I know that I have a visceral reaction when I see videos that seem to run counter to my views. And I believe that everybody or most people have that feeling. And you try and fight against it and go, no, I'm going to watch this thing that Gary Lineker's just put out about Israel or whatever. Because my immediate reaction is my head wants to dismiss it before I've even watched it, because I think this guy's an ideologue, he's on the other tribe. So all the things that, and I agree with everything you've said, but they must also be going, gosh, these people on the right, when they sit down and actually, because most of them just go, they're all psychopathic Nazis, they think we are. But if they really think about it, they go, why is it that they're not seeing the truth that we're seeing? So there must be another side to this story that you and I are just shielded from.
I'm afraid there's not. And I have a lot of experience talking to the left on this, debating them, but also I always make every effort to understand the other side. And often I naturally take the devil's advocate position. So if someone's arguing my point, I quite often end up taking the other side. I don't know why, it's just a sort of quirk that I have. And actually, I did a paper, a chapter in one of our books on reforming the education system as one way to try to get rid of woke and one way to actually increase respect for free speech. And one of the things I advocated for students to do in primary and secondary school is to have, every couple of years, force all students to debate an issue from the opposite side they would normally do, so that they're forced to consider the validity of other points and express them. Now, one of the things I always do in podcasts and interviews and debates and so forth is I try to avoid doing what many people on the left and the right do, and that's talk theoretically and try to essentially talk about emotions and feelings. And this is why I always try to stick to the facts, because I still think the facts are undeniable. I present the facts, you draw your conclusion. I think it's quite hard to draw any other conclusion than the one that I think most of our viewers understand. And as I said, as with my cousin, when she saw the facts, she couldn't deny them, because this wasn't my view, my opinion. This was the clear facts. And as I said, you challenge somebody, for example, to explain how diversity has actually benefited. And I had one person talk about the restaurants, but I was like, well, yes, they all added, we've got the recipes now, we don't need them any longer. Right?
I know where you got that from. Mr. Bean.
Yeah, so that was not the 9 o'clock news, I think, yes.
Now that we have the recipes.
And then the other one, of course, is the slavery and reparations. And I say, well, you want reparations for slavery? You living in America, living in Britain, living in the Caribbean. In what way has your life been hurt by slavery? How have you actually been disadvantaged by that? You're living in a country which has a life expectancy far longer than in West Africa. Your income is 10 times higher than in West Africa. Explain to me. And they never can.
And you'd have to take money from the black families who kept slaves as well.
Well, exactly. And you'd also have, if there were Jamaicans living here, they'd be paying reparations through taxes to people in Trinidad. Makes no sense at all. And of course, there were only a few thousand slave owners. The majority of Brits descend from people who lived lives of abject poverty akin to serfdom in the first place. So why should they pay? But you are a victim of slavery. In what way? And suddenly, all of their arguments go, because it's all based upon emotion and fluff. I deal in facts, and I think that's the only way you can hopefully bring over people on the left who aren't so radicalized. Right? That's all. I want to try to bring people who are still sitting on the fence or on the left but are reasonable and logical. You're never going to convert the complete extremists.
No. Well, even when you did so with your cousin, who I imagine was not the fact that she watched it at all, she must be quite open-minded. The fact is, you're a family member, a loved one. It's much easier to do it that way. It's like they need a friend. It's a fashion thing, and a friend of theirs has to say, like, yeah, I might vote for reform, and they might then be a bit shocked and then maybe watch something a few months later.
And be respectful. You know what happened to decent? It's like old debates where you would shake hands after having a debate, and that now even that is becoming. I've been at a couple of university debates where people have refused to shake my hand afterwards, and you just think, gosh, have we gone to the stage now where just sharing opinions now and viewpoints is a cause for cancellation?
Well, they think, if they genuinely think you're a Nazi, well then you don't. I get, they're not right. But that's what they think, isn't it?
There's visceral anger on the left. I mean, you see, you've never held someone say Labour scum, right? Or killer Labour MP, as we just had from this kneecap organisation. No. I'm told on these dating apps now it says no Tories, right? I don't think anyone's probably said no Labour or no Lib Dems.
I suppose it's because traditionally the right, the left think of the right that the right are evil, and the right think the left are stupid. So we want to talk and go, come on, guys, let me explain this to you, and they want to go, no, you're evil.
Well, as the old adage says, if you're not a liberal at 25, you have no heart. If you're not a conservative at 35, you have no brain.
Yeah, this is the thing. Bloody hell. Well, and what is Keir Starmer? I mean this almost in an existential sense. What the hell is it sort of a robot, a kind of a parach? How do you say that word? Parachik?
Apparatchik.
Apparatchik. He just seems just blank slate kind of thing.
Well, it's clear he's clearly not a person with any political acumen or instinct. I mean, it's been nothing but calamity after calamity, and he's leaden. But this, again, you have to remember, Keir Starmer is not a politician. This is a man who came very late to politics. This is a career prosecutor, and he views everything in terms of adversaries, and everything is in terms, in a certain sense, of what laws can we pass to do this? How can we transform it? Everything is seen through a legalistic, and it's also about punishment. Look at Southport and everything else. And that's not a way you're going to carry the country with you, because the country can see that. They find it very unattractive and very unappealing, added to which you have his own character, which is very bland and plastic. And as we've just seen from these local elections, I mean, there has not been. Sir John Curtis, the respected pollster, has said that no party has declined so rapidly in modern history. In its poll rating.
I think a lot of people who watched this show were probably upset when Labour got in, although it was inevitable at the time. The Tories were failing badly. Reform was nowhere near in the place it's in now. It was just inevitable. But I suppose, looking back long term, it was the best thing that could ever happen for those who want reform in at the next time.
Yeah, and remember, of course, yes, so the key thing, Labour did not win this election. The Tory party lost the election. That's the first thing to say. And of course, even though it has a great stonking majority, which normally you would think, a majority that size, you would think they're going to be in power for at least 10 years, possibly even 15 years, because it would take so long to erode. But it's a wafer-thin majority in so many constituencies. There are so many marginals where reform was nipping at the heels of Labour. And given the devastation we've just seen in the local elections, there's every reason to believe that there'll be a house of cards turning blue, particularly in the red wall seats and elsewhere. There's also, but in a certain sense, let's hope after 5 years we get the phenomenon that I saw in Canada. Canada is quite instructive on these things. Firstly, in 1993, there was something called the Reform Party of Canada, which was a party of Western Canada, which felt disconnected from the central Canada, much like the Red Wall felt disconnected from London. They became the other alternative to the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada, a real oxymoron. And the Progressive Conservative Party went from being the majority government, it went down to having only 2 seats in Parliament. And the Reform Party became the biggest party of the right in the Canadian Parliament. And it basically gobbled up the Conservatives. And there was a new party born called the Conservative Party, but essentially it was a hostile takeover. That's the hostile takeover I want to see Farage do with the Tories here. But the second thing is, we've had in Canada 10 years of Justin Trudeau, the emperor of woke. And so the people of Canada, the youth of Canada, have experienced life in the woke Valhalla. They've experienced the paradise of the far left, and they've realized what a thin veneer it is and how actually depressing that country is in terms of what's happened to that nation, in terms of freedoms, in terms of mass immigration, in terms of the cost of living and house prices and everything else. And that's why the Canadian youth are more right-wing than we've seen anywhere in the Western world, more right-wing than in America, more right-wing than in this country, because they've experienced this. So my hope is that after 5 years of Keir Starmer and the Labour Party, our youth, and we have the most radically left-wing youth in history here, it's a real challenge for the future, and they're ignorant of history as well, which is why we're having our history rewritten so easily and our past denigrated. My hope is that one of the ways we can get this youth over to the right is to actually have them experience what Starmer is like and realize actually the left isn't what they were sold, because the young of today haven't experienced a Labour government since 2010.
Yeah. And I went around university campuses and did find quite a few young people were right on the reform train. So I think that is already happening a little bit.
Well, more young people voted for reform than voted for the Tories, which is quite interesting. And the most fascinating factor is that more British male youth would vote for Trump over Farage. And that is quite a remarkable statistic.
Trump over Farage? Why?
Well,
they seem sort of aligned in many respects.
I think there are huge differences there, but it was an interesting thing thrown up by polling a few months ago.
It's this is a bit superficial, but it's got to be sort of cool for kids to all get behind something. It's got to be cool, and there's nothing less cool than Tory, the brand Tory, brand Conservative. That's not cool. Reform is a way. I think it's a way for young people to be able to vote. And as superficial as that is, it is. What about on the other side? Every action has a reaction, and I've seen you mention as well, sort of a post-truth right that's sort of burnishing in America right now, and what happens in America. We're downstream of that. What are you concerned about that?
I am concerned of it because I've seen it. I've seen lots of things on X. I'm a free speech absolutist, but I've seen lots of disturbing things on X. I've seen a rehabilitation of Adolf Hitler. I see so many posts now saying, well, he wasn't all that bad. He didn't really mean this. And I've seen so much rampant anti-Semitism. Of course, most of this stuff is coming from America, because if Brits tweeted about this, they'd have a knock on the door from PC Plot. Whereas in America, under
which
the
is
First
ridiculous.
Amendment, and I'm a free speech absolutist, but you see these characters in America doing it. I am worried about it because I'm happy to have a debate on any topic, but of course, as a historian, it has to be factually based and it has to be accurate. And the purveyors of a lot of this information are historically ignorant. Some pose as historians, some claim just to be history enthusiasts, but others are just completely ignorant of the fact. And yet they have huge platforms and huge followings. And it's not good enough to just say, well, I'm just hypothesizing here. You have a responsibility if your platform is that big. You're not just a Joe Blow. If you're saying something, you are an influencer, and you're influencing people who are very naive and ignorant and have grievances and are willing to latch on to things. And I don't like this term woke right at all, because woke is a very specific thing of the left, but I call it post-truth. And it is a post-truth society because, quite rightly, people on the right have a lot of grievances, but they are basically willing to even tear down our heroes if it advances the narrative that they want to advance. And I've challenged people to debates, and I always will challenge, and no one's taken me up on it. I think because these are positions that they know are indefensible, but they get clicks and they get views and they get monetized. And I do actually wonder how sincerely and genuinely a lot of people believe these things, and how much of it is done essentially to get engagement.
That's interesting. I think it's what frustrates me about this is that, I mean, you had to qualify by saying you're a free speech absolutist, because you know that just by you saying that, people will start saying, oh, but what about free speech? And it's a fundamental failure in understanding what free speech is, because at no point did you say, and so they should be locked up.
No, they should be free to say what they want. But I think it behooves other people to be given a chance of reply.
Yeah.
If you're going to make these arguments, I think if you are a gentleman, if you are a proper, sincere person, you would have a debate about this. If you're so willing to say something so controversial, you must be willing to be challenged on it. Because if you're not convinced by something so controversial, perhaps you shouldn't be saying it.
Well, also, I mean, that's free speech in itself. Your right to criticize those people for their views. I mean, we must remember that, because so many people don't criticize these people's views or anyone in my in-group, because that's, if you criticize them, you're against free speech. I said, no, if you don't want people to criticize, that's being against free speech.
And the moment you try to silence somebody, people will say, there must be something to it, because they don't want this information getting out.
Yeah, well, that's what happens. That's why you mustn't try and
Exactly. So you must always, sunlight is always the best disinfectant.
Polish aristocracy, you say? I mean, so Heydel-Mankoo, what's that from?
So my father's Sikh from born in Kenya, and then my mother's Polish ethnic German. They came from Saxony and Thuringia, but then also very married into Poland. We came down in the 1600s with the Elector of Saxony when he became King of Poland, and also Greek grandmother as well. So quite a smorgasbord there. So
you are a smorgasbord. Why did they have to leave Poland?
Well, because of the Second World War. So my great uncle was ADC to the Polish president, because he was the only member of the Polish aristocracy who could speak English at the time, because he had an English grandmother. And so he came over here. We went to France with Charles de Gaulle, and the Free French were all based in France. And then when France was overrun, came into London. And then, of course, at the end of the Second World War, Poland was communist. My mother was able to come over. We had some of my family were imprisoned by Stalin in Kazakhstan in the prison camps, and they went on a long march, essentially all the way. They marched all the way to meet their family in Britain, housed in refugee camps. This is one of the things I was saying. The Polish refugees, women and children in the 1940s, were housed for years, I think, in refugee camps. Why we're putting refugees today, or asylum seekers, in hotels and accommodation, I don't understand, especially when 90% of them are young men of fighting age. If tents and camps were good enough for women and children in the 1940s, if they're good enough for our own armed forces, I think, we should essentially be, emptying all the hotels, emptying all the accommodation, creating temporary refugee camps whilst they can be processed and potentially deported. Just to move on from your subject there, but I think one of the key problems we have with illegal immigration is that Britain is too attractive. It's an incentive to come to Britain still. And the French politician said this years ago. I've campaigned on this point. You need to make Britain less attractive than France. And that means, for example, not putting them up in hotels, not giving them the benefits that they're currently receiving. That means also, of course, clamping down on the underground economy, which the French do very well. That's why people come over here. So if I order something on a Deliveroo app, it will say Mohammed is coming with a picture, and then I'll have a woman or someone else entirely delivering the food.
Yeah.
They come over here, they disappear into the underground economy, into the curry houses, into all of these places. The rogue landlords who don't do checks on people they rent to, and you have 10 people living in one apartment. These are the very simple way. The universities, the low-ranking universities who grant student visas to people from the developing world, knowing that they're never going to come and study, they're going to just disappear into the underground economy. The tuition fees are their admission price to come into the country. Those are the things and processing, I always say you don't need to have anyone come to this country. You can actually just have cruise ships, old cruise ships moored off the coast of Britain in the English Channel. When dinghies come across, if they can't be turned back, they're placed directly onto these cruise ships. Once the cruise ships fill up, they're sent off to South Georgia or to the Ascension Islands, both of which are British overseas territory. By doing that, you escape the legal obstacles we had with Rwanda potentially not being safe, according to the European Court of Human Rights. We run the Ascension Islands. We run the South Georgia. we can process them there. And if they're put onto a windswept island like South Georgia, it won't be long before the message gets out. You're never coming to England. You're going to end up on a British overseas territory. And of course, ending the UN Convention. So there are lots of ways we could easily make Britain less inviting, a real hostile environment, not the milquetoast thing that Theresa May tried to do, but a real hostile environment, as the Danes have done, as the Swedes have done. That's the way that you actually get control of illegal immigration. Sorry, a bit of a tangent sidetrack there, but something I feel passionately about.
Look, it all sounds right on paper. My only concern is, and I am with you on this, it's just, it starts, did you see that movie Children of Men?
No, I know it, but I haven't seen it.
It's sort of it just looks. I mean, but that is a dystopian future, and it's just like all refugee camps everywhere, and it's just madness. But also, that's some sort of thing happens where kids can't be born, so it's a bit of a.
But who do you think's coming here? The people coming here are young men of these are economic migrants. These people aren't genuine asylum seekers. These are economic migrants. And why are they all young men coming over? It's because they are the scouts. Right, this is the way to look at it. There are scouts coming to bring the family over. So the family have pooled money together to send the son over to this country. Once they're here, they've got established, they will then be able to bring the family and relations over. This is purely about economic migration because, for example, the real asylum seekers, you're seeing that in Ukraine. Who are they? They're the women, they're the children, they're the elderly, they're the disabled. The men are back home fighting. If these people were really refugees, they would be at home. They wouldn't be leaving their wives and children to fend for themselves in a war-torn country, would they? I mean, it's quite basically obvious.
I've got one more question for you, but first, where can people find all your stuff?
Well, I'm not on all the platforms, but I am on X or Twitter at RAFHM. And also YouTube, my YouTube channel, you can see some of those debates and other things. And that is, we'll just Google Rafe Heydel-Mankoo in YouTube. I think it's the easiest way to find it.
We'll put a link below in the description as well. Who's a heretic you admire?
Leading on from a previous chat we had, my great hero, Sir Winston Churchill. I think one of the greatest heretics. People today think of Churchill as a conservative war leader, a very stern character, but actually he was one of the ultimate heretics. He great social reformer. In 1904, he left the Conservative Party and crossed the floor. He ratted great heresy to the Tory party on the issue of trade tariffs. Actually, he didn't like their trade tariff policy. He wanted free trade, so he went over to the Liberals. But he then became a great social reformer with Lloyd George. This was a man, people may not realise, this was a man who introduced better working conditions in shops and mines. He's limited the number of hours miners could work in the mines to 8 hours. He instituted the first ever tea and meal breaks, instituted the minimum wage. He created job centres. He created health insurance, employment insurance, created tribunals to help negotiate between labour workers and industry, and the Board of Trade was allowed to prosecute employers who exploited workers. Great prison reformer to improve terrible conditions in prisons, and he was regarded as a class traitor. The upper classes were up in arms about one of their own doing all of this, and to ensure that he was able to get this through Parliament, he actually proposed to abolish the House of Lords. This from a man whose father was Lord Randolph, his grandfather and his uncle were both dukes. I mean, that's pure heresy. Then, of course, in the 1930s, he went into his real heresy period where he was, as he called it, the wilderness years in the 30s, where everyone despised him in of every party almost, and because his views were so out of touch. On India, he opposed Indian self-rule and Indian independence, partly because he didn't want to weaken the British Empire, but equally because he was very concerned that it would lead to war, to bloodshed and fighting between Muslims and Hindus, and he was concerned that the Hindus would be oppressing the minorities. And of course, what happened when you got Indian independence? 2 million, well, between 1 and 2 million people died between the partition of India and Pakistan. 15 million people were displaced. Then, of course, you go into the 1940s, 45, 46, and he wanted to battle Stalin. Nobody in America saw Stalin as being in any way evil. He was the first one to ring the bell about communism and Stalin. The Americans thought he was a warmonger. He secretly wanted the Americans, he was trying to get them to do what's called Operation Unthinkable. That was when Hitler was defeated, to use the American, British, Canadian, and Polish and other forces and fight Russia and actually push the Soviet Union out of Eastern Europe back into its own borders. And my God, how Europe would have changed if there hadn't been. And he coined the phrase Iron Curtain in Missouri in 1946. And that was when he alerted the whole world to it. When he said, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended. very heretical doing that. And then, of course, the big one, the final one, obviously Adolf Hitler. In the 30s, he was the lone voice, the key voice in the wilderness, warning about the rise of Hitler and Nazism, urging the British government to rearm and prepare itself. And everybody in politics thought he was a warmonger, banging the drum for war. Quite the opposite. He believed that that would be a deterrent. He wanted to stop Hitler from doing anything. And he thought only if we are strong and carry a big stick would we be able to try to deter Hitler. And of course, as we know, when Hitler went into the Rhineland in 1936, which was a demilitarized zone after the First World War, Hitler had given instructions, if the French mobilize, we're going to retreat. He was so scared that something might happen and he wasn't prepared to actually engage. And so it's entirely possible that if the world had listened to Winston Churchill in the 1930s, who knows, the war could have been avoided. So that is my great heretic.
That's a fantastic heretic. Thank you for that. And people, please go and follow Rafe. We're going to have the YouTube and Twitter links down below. He's been absolutely brilliant. His channel's great as well. I was checking it out before. It's so good. He knows so much stuff. So go over, check that out. Hit this like button. Make sure you subscribe to this channel because that helps, and keep watching.